The afternoon sun launched a merciless shine over the vast extent of the savannah, a dried grass tapestry and lonely acaciars who danced to the taste of the hot and dusty breeze. In the heart of that immensity, a magnificent bull, a copy of strength and vitality, grazed quietly, oblivious to the danger that was sneaking through the low vegetation. Its dark coat shone in the light, each muscle waving with contained power, a witness to the indomitable strength of wildlife. He was the king of his small portion of the world, a kind giant who knew every sound, every smell of that territory. The air was heavy with the heat and tinnitus of the insects, a constant melody that packed the apparent peace of that ecosystem. The bull moved slowly, his big head swinging from side to side, a silent guardian of his own existence, confident in his strength and dominion over that African piece of land. His breathing was deep and rhythmic, a sound that mingled with the symphony of nature around him, an imposing and serene presence. In the blink of an eye, the tranquility was shattered. Of the tall grass-centered shadows, a long, muscular shape burst with a terrifying speed. It was a python of rocks, an ancestral predator whose existence was a testimony of the deadly efficiency of nature. The serpent, a mosaic of brown and green patterns that camouflaged her perfectly, launched on the rear paw of the bull. The surprise was total. An ambush executed with the accuracy of millennia of evolution. The bull released a low shade of shock and pain, his massive body shaking with the sudden impact. The initial squeeze was like an angry iron, an acute pain that signaled the beginning of a struggle desperate for survival. Peace had been irrevocably broken, giving way to a primal confrontation, a macabre dance between brute force and relentless constriction. The predator and prey were now locked in a deadly hug, a silent duel under the impassive gaze of the African sky. The savannah, once a place of calm, had become an arena of life or death. The bull, recovering from the initial shock, reacted with the fury of his lineage. He debated himself, trying to get rid of the lethal squeeze, his mighty corpus writhing in vain attempts to escape. The dust rose in dense clouds around the two combatants, obscuring the scene in a veil of earth and despair. Each attempted escape, each violent kick was received with a calculated python response. The serpent, a master of leverage and pressure, used his own weight and bull's strength against him. With each movement of the mammal, the serpent's spirals tightened more, a living knot that inexorably climbed through its body. The air was beginning to miss the bull lungs, its immense strength being slowly drained by overwhelming pressure. His breathing has become shallow and desperate archeons, his heart beating uncontrollably against his ribs, a drum announcing his agony. The struggle was a spectacle of pure strength and resistance, a battle of wills in the wild heart of nature. The minutes became an eternity of suffering. The python, with sinister patience, continued its methodical work. Their spirals, thick like the trunk of a small tree, now involved the taurus torso, compressing their vital organs with an unimaginable force. The savannah giant was being subdued, his once imposing force fading with every passing second. His eyes, once full of life and power, began to look at a mixture of panic and resignation. He was still fighting, but his movements were weaker, more spasmic, the last traces of a fading resistance. The silence of the savannah was now filled only by his suffocated moans and the dry sound of the snake's scales brushing each other. It was the soundtrack of a slow and cruel death, a scene as old as time itself, the relentless law of the food chain, to unfold in all its brutality. The sun continued to slow down the horizon, painting the sky with orange and red shades, a spectacular background for a silent tragedy. The bull world has reduced to a mist of pain and darkness. The pressure on his chest was unbearable. Each attempt to inspire was a lost battle. He felt his bones to grit under the strength of constriction, his vision to darken at the edges. The vitality that defined him was being crushed, extinguished by a predator who did not know haste or piety. The serpent, in turn, was on its element, a perfectly adapted killing machine. Her body was an instrument of death, each muscle working in harmony to subdue a prey often heavier than her. There was no malice in his attack, only pure instinct and the need to survive. For the python, the bull was not a magnificent creature, but simply a meal, a source of energy that would support it for weeks, perhaps months. The predator's indifference was almost scarier than his strength, a demonstration of the emotional disconnection that rules the animal kingdom. Life was being taken with cold and calculated efficiency. Hope, an almost strange concept in that primal struggle, was beginning to disappear completely. The bull was losing consciousness, his body giving in to the inevitability of defeat. His legs fraggled and he fell sideways, a giant knocked down, his fall raising another cloud of dust. The python adjusted its squeeze, taking advantage of the new position to apply even more pressure. The victory seemed certain for the reptile. The savannah, with its vast and silent audience of trees and rocks, was the only witness to that imminent death. There was no one to intervene, no one to save the bull from his cruel destiny. Nature followed its course, indifferent to the individual suffering of one of its creatures. The jungle law, so often romanticized, showed its crude and merciless face. Life was about to be extinguished, and the silence that would follow would be the only elegy for the fallen bull. The darkness approached both literally, with the sun as figurative, with the life of the bull coming to an end. The sounds of the fight, though stuffy, did not completely go unnoticed. The agony of the bull, his suffocated mugidos, and the sound of his body to struggle against the ground traveled through the afternoon breeze. They were subtle sounds, easily lost in the vastness of the plain, but for a trained ear, they told a story of danger and despair. Nature, although it seemed indifferent, had its own forms of communication, its own alarm systems. A frightened bird that raises flight, the sudden silence of a normally noisy area, or the distinct sound of a struggle of life or death. These were signs that could be read by those who knew the language of the jungle. That day, the bull agony would not be a secret kept only by the savannah. His suffering, although silent to the world of men, had created a ripple in the tissue of the ecosystem, a cry of help that, against all the probabilities, was about to be heard. The hope, which seemed extinct, would find one last and unexpected breath. The bull's head hung, his eyes almost closed. The last breath of air seemed to have abandoned his lungs. The python, feeling the imminent cessation of the struggle, began to adjust his jaws, preparing for the long process of swallowing his prey. The drama seemed to have reached its dark and predictable climax. The cycle of life and death was about to complete. But fate sometimes reserves surprises, twists that challenge logic and expectation. The story of that bull and that python had not yet ended. A new chapter was about to begin, a chapter that would introduce a new actor on this wild stage, an actor whose presence would change the course of events in a way no one could predict. The silent agony of the bull was about to give way to an even more shocking and unexpected confrontation. The savannah kept its secrets, and the greatest of them was about to be revealed. The final squeeze. The python contracted its muscles one last time, applying the maximum pressure. The body of the bull was still. The silence descended over the scene, a heavy silence and loaded with purpose. For any observer, the fight had ended. The serpent had won. The bull was dead, or to seconds of death. The law of nature had been fulfilled. The predator will ensure its survival at the expense of the life of its prey. It was a scene that had been repeatedly repeated over the age, a fundamental pillar of wild balance. However, at that moment of apparent conclusion, soil vibrations began to change. A distant sound, a low, heavy snoring, began to approach. It was not the sound of the wind, nor the sound of a vehicle. It was something different, something organic and powerful. The agony of the bull, though silent to distant human ears, had sent a sign, a message of opportunity or danger that had been intercepted by another formidable creature of that land. The curtain had not yet fallen about this real-life drama. Miles away from the silent fight, in a small goalkeeper, the radio crackled, breaking the afternoon monotony. The call was not about the bull and the python, not directly. It was from a local safari guide, his tense voice with a contained urgency. He reported seeing a large bull to go to a notoriously dense area known to be the habitat of great python. It was not a request for help, but a warning, a shared concern between those who lived and worked in the jungle. He mentioned hearing a strange sound, a death thud followed by a disturbing silence before losing the animal in sight. It was vague information, almost insignificant in the great scheme of things. However, for the rangers, used to interpreting the subtle signs of nature, it was enough to arouse a sense of apprehension. They knew that bull, but dominant male known for his strength, and knew that few things in the savannah could disturb him. The seed of concern was planted. The chief ranger, a man named David, with more than 20 years of experience in those lands, took his binoculars and ran out the horizon from the watchtower. He could not see anything unusual, only that golden vastness to extend to where the view reached. But his instinct, cleared by years of observation and meetings with life and death in the jungle, told him something was wrong. The description of the guide, though inaccurate, painted a worrying picture. A bull of that size did not simply disappear in silence. A confrontation with another animal would be noisy, visible. A meeting with a python, however, would be exactly as described. A quick attack followed by a silent and deadly struggle. David felt a shiver through his spine despite the scorching heat. He knew the power of an adult python and knew that if his suspicion was correct, time was a critical factor. Every minute that passed diminished the chances of bull survival. He came down from the tower with a decision on his face. "Come on," he told his younger colleague, a young ranger named Ben. "Take the jeep and the equipment. I think our old friend is in trouble." There was no need for further explanations. Ben, who idolized David and fully trusted his trial, ran to prepare the vehicle. The equipment not only included weapons, but also strings, long hooks, and a first aid kit for large animals. They were not going to hunt. They were going on a rescue mission, a dangerous and often fruitless intervention against the forces of nature. But it was their duty, their vocation. They were the guardians of that place, the unlikely mediators between the beauty and brutality of wildlife. While Ben was preparing the jeep, David drew a mental map, calculating the fastest route to the area that guides the guide, his brain quickly processing the variables: the terrain, the time of day, the likely place of the attack. The desperate so-called was not a scream, but a whisper, a series of small clues that only the most experienced could gather. It was the concern in the voice of the guide, the prior knowledge of the bull behavior, and the sharp instinct of a veteran ranger. It was a puzzle mounted from fragments of information, an image of danger that became clearer with every second. While the Jeep snored and came to life, David felt the adrenaline start to flow. He knew the chances were minimal. Intervening in a python attack was extremely dangerous, not only because of the serpent, but also because of the panicked prey, which could easily hurt its saviors. However, the idea of letting that magnificent animal die a slow and agonizing death without even trying to help was unthinkable. It was a matter of principle, of respect for the life they swore to protect. The so-called had been answered. Radio communication continued as they walked away from the station. David asked for updates to other watchdogs, other guides in the area, trying to triangular the exact location. The answer was always the same. No sighting, a disturbing silence that seemed to confirm its worst suspicions. The savannah was keeping its secret, the scene of the hidden fight of curious eyes. For the Rangers, this meant that they would have to trust their experience and knowledge of the terrain to find the place. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack that stretched through hundreds of square kilometers. But they didn't give up. The image of the bull, a symbol of the indomitable force of Africa, to be slowly crushed to death was a powerful motivation. It was a race against time, a desperate search driven by a barely heard call. The journey began, the Jeep lifting dust while accelerating the dirt roads. The sun was beginning to go down, throwing long shadows on the landscape and painting the sky with vibrant colors. The beauty of sunset contrasted strongly with the dark urgency of its mission. Every bump of the vehicle, every branch that scratched the painting, was a reminder of the difficult terrain they had to cross. Ben kept his eyes fixed on the road, his firm hands on the steering wheel, while David perambling the landscape with binoculars, looking for any sign. Vultures to circulate, the abnormal movement of vegetation, anything that could take them to the bull. The tension within the Jeep was palpable. A mixture of concentration, anxiety, and a railroad determination. They were two men in a small metal box, on their way to challenge one of the most primal scenes in nature. The desperate so-called, in essence, was the silent cry of the bull himself, transmitted through the chain of human observation and technology. It was the voice of nature, to be interpreted by those who heard it carefully. Without the safari guide, his concern and his call, the fate of the bull would be sealed. Without David's experience and instinct, the guide's warning could have been ignored. It was an unlikely chain of events, a series of small decisions and observations that converged to create a possibility of rescue. The hope of the bull now resting on the wheels of that Jeep and the courage of the two men who led him. It was a testimony of the connection between man and nature, a demonstration that even in a wild and often cruel world, compassion and duty could play a role. The last radio communication before losing the signal was from the original guide. I am seeing birds acting strangely near the great rocky outcrop east of their position. Many of them. It seems to be being disturbed by something on the floor. This was the clue they needed. David located the rocky outcrop on his mind map and gave Ben new instructions. The blind search now had a focus, a destination. The adrenaline increased. They were approaching. The desperate so-called had finally led them in the right direction. Now the real proof would begin. Finding the scene was one thing. Intervening and surviving was another completely different. The sun dived below the horizon, and the darkness began to surround the savannah, adding another layer of danger and difficulty to its mission already scary. The Jeep softened, the lights cutting the growing darkness. David signaled Ben to turn off the engine. They would continue to walk from there, so as not to scare the animals further and to approach without being detected. The silence that followed was deep, broken only by the sound of the wind and the distant corner of a night bird. They took their equipment and began to walk cautiously toward the rocky outcrop, their senses on maximum alert. The desperate so-called had led them to the threshold of danger. Now they would have to enter it, armed only with their courage and their desire to make a difference. The fate of the bull was a few meters away, hidden in the thickest shadows, and the result of his intervention was anything but right. The African night was full of secrets, and they were about to discover one of the deadliest. The jeep of the rangers devoured the irregular ground with a mechanical urgency. Each bump and each dive into the grooves of the dirt road was a blow to its occupants. Time was your most relentless enemy, even more than any predator they could find. David looked at the sky, where the sun had turned into a carmesine fireball to touch the horizon, knowing that darkness you bring a new dimension of danger to his task. In the African night, the predators had the advantage, their senses perfectly adapted to the lack of light. His rescue mission, already dangerous in daylight, you become almost suicidal in total darkness. The pressure was immense, an invisible force that pushed the accelerator and sharpened its senses. Each second lost was a second gain for the python, a second less life for the bull. The landscape passed them in a blur of yellow and brown, a screen that became progressively darker. Ben, though younger, drove with an expertise that denied his age. He knew those clues like the lines of his own hand, knowing exactly when he accelerates in a line and when he slows down to a treacherous curve or a dry riverbed. Its concentration was total. Your face is a mask of determination. He did not speak, focusing on all his energy in the task of bringing the jeep to his destination as fast and safe as possible. He felt the weight of responsibility, not only to the life of the bull, but also to David, his mentor. He could not fail. The engine's snoring was the only sound inside the vehicle, a hymn to its desperate race against the biological clock of death by constriction. The dust that rose behind them was a flag of his hasty passage, a sign for the savannah that the guardians were in motion. The guide information about the bustling birds near the rocky outcrop, apart from their salvation board. Without it, they would be wandering through the fool of the savannah, their search as futile as trying to find a single sheet in a forest. David grabbed this information, using it as a headlight in the approaching darkness. He sailed by instinct, combining the map of his head with the mark of the landscape he recognized. "More to the left, Ben. It gets around that group of acacia. We should cut the way there," he instructed, his calm but firm voice cutting the noise of the engine. His experience was the rudder that guided his speed, his wisdom to ensure that the hurry would not lead them to a fatal error, such as falling into a hidden ditch or ranking the jeep in cute sand. It was a delicate balance between speed and caution, a dangerous dance on the limit of control. As they approached the indicated area, a new sense of urgency took over them. Now it was not just the time that pressured them, but the proximity of danger. They knew they were entering the territory of a top predator, one that would be in the middle of a hunt or worse, defending his meal. The risk to themselves increased every meter. David checked his shotgun, not with the intention of using it, but as a necessary precaution. His preference was always not to intervene, but in the jungle, self-preservation had to be a priority. Ben felt the change in the atmosphere, the tension thickening. The race against time was becoming an incursion into enemy territory. Her heart was beating faster, a mixture of fear and excitement, the adrenaline preparing him for the confrontation that was ahead. The terrain became more difficult, forcing Ben to slow it. Dense rocks and shrubs blocked the most straightforward way, forcing them to deviate that seemed to consume precious minutes. The frustration was palpable. Being so close and being delayed by natural obstacles was a form of torture. The sun had completely disappeared, plunging the world into a deep blue and gray palette. Ben turned on the headlights of the Jeep, two beams of light that cut the darkness, but also announced his presence to any creature he was observing. The race was reaching its critical point. They knew that the bull, if it was still alive, would only be a few minutes, maybe seconds, air. His window of opportunity was closing quickly, the darkness to swallow his last rendering of hope. Finally, through the trees, they spotted the dark outline of rocky outcrop against the starry sky. "There," said David, his voice little more than a whisper. "Turn off the engine. From here, let's go." The silence that followed the engine's stop was deafening. Only the sound of the wind to whistle between the rocks and the tinnitus of the night insects. They left the Jeep, moving with a practiced stealth. Each step was deliberate, every sound amplified by the stillness of the night. They caught their equipment, strings, hooks, and potent flashlights. The race against motorized time had ended. Now the final persecution began, a slow, tense walk toward the unknown, towards the sound of the guide that the guide had described, the silence that meant the struggle was coming to an end, one way or another. The light of his lanterns danced over the rocks and vegetation, creating long and ghostly shadows. Each shadow seemed a danger, every rustle of leaves an imminent attack. The air was cold, and they could smell the damp land and night vegetation. And then they smelled another, an all-button and primal odor, the smell of reptile. They were close, very close. David signaled Ben to stop, and both crouched down, erasing their flashlights. They waited. Their ears strove to capture any sound, and then they heard him. A low sound, an archaement, almost imperceptible. It was the sound of a lum fighting for the last trace of air. The bull was still alive. The race against time was not lost yet. A wire of hope, fragile but real, rekindled into their hearts. With infinite care they advanced, bypassing a large rock that blocked their vision. The scene that turned out to the soft shine of the moon was both horrible and mesmerizing. The massive and dark shape of the bull was on the floor, almost completely wrapped in the thick spirals of a gigantic python. The bull's head was raised at an foreign angle, its only visible eye reflecting the moonlight with a desperate shine. Oblivious to our presence, continued her rhythmic and deadly contraction. The Rangers had arrived at the last possible moment. The race against time had brought them to the threshold of death. Now the question was, what could they do? How could they, two men, face that force of nature and include the balance in favor of life? The decision had to be made instantly. There was no time for debates or complex plans. David looked at Ben, and a silent understanding passed between them. The silence was heavy, filled only by the sound of the wind and the bull's dying archer. The Rangers knew that the window for the intervention was tiny. Death by asphyxiation was imminent. The hug of death was not a tightening that could simply untie. It was an active process, a constant and growing force that would not cease until the heart of the prey stopped beating. His presence there, with his lanterns and equipment, seemed inappropriate, almost a futile intrusion in an old and relentless law. Right away from David's initial shock, he took control. He evaluated the situation with a quick and clinical look. The snake's head was stuck under his own spirals, protected and focused on his task. Attacking his head was impossible without risking injuring the bull. Pulling the spirals would be like trying to double steel bars. Her only hope was to make the serpent feel threatened, forcing her to choose between keeping her prey or defending herself. "Ben," David whispered, his tense voice, "let's make noise. Beat the rocks, try to scare her, but it's ready to back off. If she turns to us, we run." It was a rudimentary plan, born of despair, but it was the only thing that happened to them. They could not simply shoot the serpent, as the bullets could ricochet or cross and reach the bull. The intervention had to be non-lethal, but shocking enough to break the predator concentration. They began to hit their metal hooks against the nearby rocks. The sharp sound broke the silence of the night. The noise echoed through the landscape, an artificial alarm in an organic world. The python reacted. His massive body shuddered, and for a brief second, the squeeze seemed to loosen slightly. The bull took advantage of this second fraction to suck a breath of noisy and desperate air. It was a small success, a momentary victory. Encouraged, the rangers increased the noise, shouting and beating harder. The serpent's head began to emerge from his spirals, his forked tongue to prove the air, trying to identify the source of the disturbance. His black eyes without eyelids, devoid of any recognizable emotion, settled in both men. The hug of death was being challenged, and the predator was taking note of his challengers. The python, however, was not easily determined. He had spent hours, perhaps days, pursuing and ambushing this massive prey. Hunger was a powerful instinct, and she was not willing to leave such a substantial meal because of a little noise. Instead of freeing the bull, she readjusted her squeeze, squeezing further, as if to tell her to the intruders that her prey was yours and that would not be delivered lightly. The momentary hope of the rangers faded. Your plan was not working. The serpent considered them irritation, not a real threat. Frustration and impotence began to settle. They were there, a few meters away, witnessing a slow death, and their attempts to prevent it were as effective as throwing stones at the ocean. The hug of death was stronger than his courage. Desperation began to take care of Ben. He looked at David. His eyes asked her, "And now?" David had no answer. He felt the weight of defeat. They had run over time, had found the bull, but were failing in the most crucial part. He cursed his impotence. Preparing to see an animal die was something. Trying to save him and fail was another, a much more acute pain. The bull, feeling the squeeze to intensify again, let out one last moan, a sound of total and absolute defeat. It seemed that this would be the end. The rangers would have to watch, powerless, while the death of death completed their work. Savannah was about to complain another life, and they would be the silent witnesses of their departure. The moon seemed to look down with cold indifference, a heavenly spectator of a hopeless earthly drama. It was at this moment of absolute despair that a new sound joined the symphony of the night. It was not the sound of the wind, nor the sound of the rangers. It was a low and guttural sound, a growl that seemed to vibrate his own floor. It came from the shadows, somewhere behind them. David and Ben froze, their hearts jumped to their throat. They were not alone. His attention, totally focused on the serpent and the bull, had left them vulnerable. They turned slowly, their flashlights shake in their hands, and pointed the beams of light toward the sound. What they saw made blood freeze in their veins. The embrace of the python's death, which was moments earlier the center of his universe, suddenly became a secondary concern. A new and much more unpredictable actor had just entered the scene. From the shadows, a massive and hairy shape emerged. A male pardo bear, a giant of muscles and hair, was a few meters of them. It was an anomaly. The bears were not common in that specific part of the savannah, but their presence was undeniable and terrifying. He was standing on his rear paws, his nose twisted, smelling the air. His little eyes fired on the scene in front of him, the men, the bull, and the python. The bear did not seem angry or aggressive, but curious, attracted by the smell of struggle and imminent death. For the rangers, the situation had gone from dangerous to potentially fatal. They were trapped between a giant python and a pardo bear, two of the most formidable predators on the planet. The embrace of the death of the bull now seemed a prelude to his own misfortune. The bear released another growl, a sound that seemed to shake his own rocks. He completely ignored the two men, his attention totally captured by the drama that unfolded on the floor. The python, feeling the presence of a new and massive competitor, hesitated. His body, which was once the epitome of predatory trust, now showed signs of uncertainty. The embrace of death, which had been challenged by the noise of men, was now being questioned by the presence of a super predator. The atmosphere was loaded with an unbearable tension. No one moved. The rangers, the bear, the python, and the merciless were all arrested in a bizarre and deadly impasse. The next movement would decide the fate of all of them, and no one, not even the experienced David, could predict what this movement would be. The night was about to get much stranger. The bear's appearance was so sudden and so out of context that for a moment, David thought the tension was making him hallucinating. But the low growl and the 2 tons of muscle and from what rose in the shadows were unmistakably real. An unexpected shadow had fallen over the scene, obscuring the already intense drama between the python and the bull with a new layer of unpredictable danger. The bear, a colossus of nature, was momentarily standing on his rear paws, his muzzle contracting as he analyzed the situation with an almost palpable animal intelligence. His small dark eyes did not fix themselves in the rangers, for his immense relief, but in the contorted mass of the snake and his prey. He was not a casual spectator. He had been attracted to the smell of the fight, the promise of an easy meal. The rangers, who moments before they felt as interveners, were now mere spectators of a titan confrontation. The bear dropped over the 4 legs and began to approach slowly, with a heavy and deliberate floor that left no doubt about his trust. Each step seemed to make the floor shake. His focus was entirely in the python. The serpent, in turn, felt the approach of the new threat. His body, which was curled firmly around the bull, began to move differently. The rhythmic pressure of the constriction was replaced by defensive stiffness. The head of the python, which had remained hidden, emerged completely, turning to face the bear. His bifurcated tongue was frantically trying to collect as much information as possible about this new and formidable opponent. The hug of death over the bull ceased visibly, not for mercy, but out of necessity. The python now had to divide his attention between keeping his prey and defending himself from a possible attack. The bull, feeling the decrease in pressure, managed to suck a breath of deep and noisy air, a sound that seemed to echo on the silent night. It was a sound of life, a sound that moments earlier seemed impossible. The rangers watched, fascinated and terrified, without daring to move a muscle. They were witnessing an interaction that few humans ever saw. A direct confrontation between a pardo bear and a python of rocks because of a still-alive carcass. The bear stopped a few meters from the serpent, dropping a low and threatening growl. It was not a sound of total aggression, but a clear warning, a statement of intent. He was claiming the prey. His posture, his head down and his shoulders bent, radiated immense and contained power. He was giving the serpent an opportunity to retreat. What happened next was the moment that would be recorded forever in the memory of the rangers. The bear, instead of attacking the serpent with a blind fury, did something surprisingly strategic. With an incredible speed for his size, he advanced and gave a powerful dig, not in the bull, but directly in the python's spirals. His claws, feature films and curves like daggers, ripped the scales and meat of the serpent. The python has made pain and surprise his body thurkle violently. The bear retreated immediately, avoiding any attempt to retaliate the serpent, and then attacked again elsewhere. He was not trying to kill the serpent instantly. He was harassing her, inflicting pain, making her position unsustainable. He was using his intelligence, his superior strength, and his natural weapons in a tactical and deliberate way. The python, confronted with an attack that could not predict or defend, and with the searing pain of his wounds, made a decision. Survival surpassed hunger. With one last and violent spasm, she began to unfold from the bull. It was a quick and desperate process. The spirals that moments before were an instrument of death became a disadvantage, making it slow and vulnerable. The bear watched, allowing her to break free, knowing that her victory was assured. As soon as the last spiral was released, the python, wounded and defeated, quickly slid down the darkness of the rocks, leaving behind her meal almost won. The unexpected shadow had not only saved the bull, but also completely redefined the hierarchy of power in that small clearing. The bear then stood upon the fallen and exhausted bull. The rangers arrested their breath. They had just watched an unlikely rescue just to see the savior turn into the new executioner. The bull was too weak to defend himself, his life now in the bear's paws. The bear lowered his massive head and smelled the bull, his nose to go through the flank of the injured animal. The bull shuddered, but did not move, resigned to his destiny. David lifted his shotgun, his finger in the trigger, although he knew it was a futile gesture. If the bear decided to kill the bull, nothing could prevent him. The tension was unbearable. The life of the bull, saves from the snake's spirals, now hung for an even thinner thread. And then, the final shock. The bear, after inspecting the bull for a long moment, raised his head. He looked at the rangers, not threatened, but with apparent indifference. Then he turned, and with the same heavy and deliberate pace with which he had arrived, walked away, disappearing in the shadows from which he had come. He didn't touch the bull. He did not claim his meal. His behavior challenged the entire logic of predatory nature. He intervened, attacked the python, saved the bull, and then simply left, as if his task was accomplished. The rangers were absolutely silent, their minds trying to sue what they have just witnessed. It made no sense. Why would a bear risk a confrontation with a giant python just to abandon the reward? The unexpected shadow turned out to be a shadow of death, but of inexplicable salvation. The rangers remained real estate for several minutes, even after the sound of the bear's steps were faded in the distance. They looked at each other, their faces a mixture of astonishment, confusion, and a deep feeling of admiration. Nature, which moments earlier showed them their most brutal and relentless face, had just shown them a mysterious, almost mystical side. The bear had not acted like a predator, but as a guardian, an unlikely protector. His intervention was not hungry, but for another reason, a reason that they might never understand. Finally, breaking the spell, David lowered his gun and walked slowly toward the bull. The animal was still on the floor, its irregular breathing but becoming stronger every second. He was alive. Against all the odds, against the spirals of a python and the presence of a bear, he had survived. The unexpected shadow had not only changed the course of that night, but also changed the perception of those two men about the complex and unscrutable laws that govern the wild world. The shock of the bear action was not its power, but its inexplicable and impressive mercy. The night was far from finishing, for now they had a wounded bull to treat, but their work would be done with a new sense of reverence and amazement. In the stillness that followed by the bear's departure, the savannah seemed to sustain her breath. David and Ben approached cautiously to the fallen bull, his soft steps on the dusty floor. The giant was exhausted, his body marked by the pressure of the python spirals, but his flanks climbed and descended with the constant rhythm of the breath. Life, which had been so close to being extinct, now pulsed with renewed toughness. The eyes of the bull, which once reflected the terror of death, were now calm, observing the two men with a kind of resigned lassitude. There was no fear of them, just a deep tiredness. It was as if the animal understood, at a primal level, that these beings did not represent a threat, that its trial had ended. The invisible ties of nature, which moments earlier manifested in a brutal confrontation, now revealed a more subtle facet of coexistence and recovery. David knelt beside its massive bull head, his hand hanging for a moment before gently touching its forehead. The skin was hot and humid. The ranger spoke to the animal in a low, soothing voice, not words that the bull could understand, but with a tone that conveyed security and comfort. Ben began preparing his first aid kit, removing antiseptic and ointments to treat the superficial wounds left by the bear clutches in the serpent, some of whom scratched the bull in the process. His work was methodical and efficient, a contrast to the confusion and astonishment they still felt. They were dealing with an animal that, for all logic, should be dead, except for an intervention that challenged any explanation. Each touch, each movement, was made with a deep respect for the incredible resilience of the creature. As they worked in the light of their lanterns, they couldn't stop thinking about the bear. His action had been so deliberate, so purposeful. Why would he intervene? One theory was that the bear saw the python as a competitor in her territory and simply expelled her, disinterested from the Taurus carcass. Another, more far-fetched, was that he had been attracted to the struggle and, seeing the situation, his instinct somehow led him to attack the most unfair predator. No explanation seemed adequate. The image of the bear moving away, leaving behind such an easy meal, was a puzzle that his logical minds of humans could not solve. They were confronting the mystery of animal behavior, the possibility that there are motivations in the wild world that go beyond simple survival and dominion. After treating the most visible wounds and managing an injection of antibiotics to prevent infections, the rangers decided that the best to do was to let the bull rest. Moving it would be impossible and unnecessary. He needed time to regain his strength. They decided to camp nearby to watch overnight to protect him from hyenas or other necrophages that could be attracted to the smell of blood. Sitting next to a small fire, at a safe distance from the bull, they spoke in a low voice about the events of the night. The conversation always returned to the bear. "I have never seen anything like this," said Ben, shaking his head in disbelief. It was as if he knew, as if they were restoring some kind of balance. David, the cynical veteran, didn't have a better answer. He just looked at the flames, his face reflecting the dancing light, lost in thoughts. The night passed without more incidents. The bull remained on the ground, its breathing becoming increasingly regular and deep. At dawn, when the first rays of sunshine painted the sky of pink and gold, something wonderful happened. With a great effort, the bull began to move his legs. He fought for a few minutes, his muscles protesting, but finally, with a low moan, he managed to stand. He stood there to sway for a moment, his legs tremble with weakness, but he was standing, a giant who had refused to fall. David and Ben watched silently, their hearts full of emotion that was a mixture of relief and triumph. Their mission had been a success in a way that they could never have planned or imagined. Life had won. The bull took a few hesitant steps, then stopped and looked toward the two men. There was no sign of recognition, no gratitude in the human sense. It was just a long and calm look, a quiet sharing of a moment in time. Then he turned and began to walk slowly toward a small pond of water nearby. His recovery journey was starting. The rangers watched him move away, his clipped silhouette against the rising sun. They were not just guardians of wildlife. They had become part of a story about unexpected ties and the mysterious web of life that connects all creatures. They had been witnesses of an act that seemed to transcend the brutality of nature. As they arranged their camp to return to the station, the rangers felt a change within themselves. The savannah no longer seemed the same. It was no longer just a place of beauty and danger, life and death. It was a place of mystery, of inexplicable wonders. The memory of the bear, the unlikely savior, and the Taurus, the survivor Tanaz, would stay with them forever. It was a story they would tell many times, but they might never explain completely. And that was its beauty. Nature did not need to be fully understood to be respected and admired. The ties they witnessed that night were not of friendship or covenant in the human sense, but something deeper, a tacit recognition of strength, life, and the right to exist. The return trip was silent, but it was a comfortable silence, filled with a shared understanding. They had come out in a race against time to save an animal, and in the process had received a lesson on the complexities of the world they swore to protect. They saw death closely, but also witnessed an act of salvation that seemed almost miraculous. The bull would survive. The python, wounded, probably too, and the bear would continue its lonely existence, a walking puzzle in the vast plains. Their lives intersected by a brief and dramatic moment, creating a story that spoke of struggle, survival, and the possibility of mercy in the most unexpected places. When the jeep arrived at the station, the sun was already high in the sky. The world seemed normal, as if the previous night had not been a dream. But for David and Ben, nothing would be totally normal again. They carried with them the knowledge that savannah kept much deeper secrets than they imagined. They had seen the ferocity of the food chain and, in the same breath, an act that challenged it. The history of the bull, python, and bear has become a legend in the rangers community, a reminder that in the great theater of wildlife, the papers are not always fixed, and the plot can take a shocking and inspiring course. Nature's ties were, in fact, much stranger and wonderful than any of them could have dreamed. In the vastness of the African savannah, a relentless law rules life and death. When an imposing bull finds himself stuck in the overwhelming hug of a giant python, his destination looks sealed. The struggle is a brute force spectacle against deadly patience, and the result seems inevitable. Alerted by a desperate so-called, the Rangers start a race against time, an unlikely rescue mission under a red sky. But when they arrive, they find an even more terrifying impasse. What could be more shocking than this primal confrontation? The answer comes in the form of an unexpected shadow, a new predator that comes into play. However, their actions will challenge all that the experienced rangers thought they know about the animal kingdom. Get ready to witness a true story that reveals the mysterious and inexplicable bonds of nature, where the savior arises in the most unlikely way, and the shock is not in the fight, but in an act of Cleomite that no one could predict.